Content warning, abortion. The first portion of this episode consists of Reverend Michelle and Father Andrew discussing the abortion situation and debate as it exists at the time of recording in the United States. Both are firmly pro-choice and approach the issue with a great deal of compassion for women who find themselves in a position where they are considering an abortion or seeking an abortion. But we understand that this discussion might be difficult for some people. They do not directly mention the movie during this discussion, so if you wish to skip to 16 minutes and 23 seconds, you should be able to follow along fairly easily. Or if you need to skip this episode entirely, we understand. Thank you very much.
A pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater. Hi, I'm Father Andrew Miller.
And I'm Reverend Michelle Byerly.
And this is A Pastor and a Priest Walk Into a Movie Theater, a podcast about faith, life, and the silver screen. Today we'll be discussing the 1999 drama film, The Cider House Rules.
We encourage you to watch the movie first, but for those of you who have not, a brief synopsis is that it is set in the 1940s and Maine, and it's about this home that is run by this doctor who performs medical procedures, but it's also about quite a bit more in the process about growing up, life, ethics. So we will get into all of that. I was the one who picked this movie because part of the conversation that it does talk about is abortion. It is not the only part of the conversation, but with everything that is going on right now in our Supreme Court and the cases that it's hearing, I felt like it was a timely discussion to have and really bring some rich opportunity to dig into faith, ethics, just some of the practical things. So
I suppose we should tackle the abortion issue first. Now, I'm curious, how do you want to tackle the abortion issue? Because it is an issue I feel that one needs to tread lightly with.
Yeah, so with that, I will give our viewers, the statistics are that a significant percentage of women in the United States have had an abortion at some point. And so you're right that we definitely want to start by acknowledging that difficulty and acknowledging that it's a hard topic for anybody because it is one of those that is so emotionally charged. And, you know, you don't just go and have an abortion at the best moment of your life, right? You know, it's always in the midst of challenges and conversation. And so I want to acknowledge that first, and I want to acknowledge the way that sometimes the conversation has been had is done in a way that adds to that pain. And so I just want to start by acknowledging that for our listeners, and to, if that has impacted you, know that we hear that pain, know that we acknowledge that, and that you are valued no matter where you are in this conversation.
What are your thoughts on the ethics of abortion?
So it would not be my first option in most cases. However, I very much understand the necessity to have it available for those. I mean, there are just so many circumstances that are beyond anyone's control or understanding to say, you know, to just put this blanket statement, we can't do it, you know. And I think that this movie kind of explores some of those, which is, I think, why it's a good conversation. As I said, anyone who is having an abortion, it's a tough conversation. And so if I were a pastor who was having that conversation with someone, I would sit down with them and say, you know, where are you at with this? What's your understanding? You know, what are the options? My ethic very much is that the person, it's ultimately between the woman and her doctor. If she's married, I definitely think there's a place to have the conversation with the spouse, but it's really not his decision ultimately. I know that, and part of this is I'm just speaking a little bit as I'm still working through this myself in some ways because it is such a complicated topic. I definitely think that making it safe and available is an aspect of caring for women.
Well, it seems to me that part of what makes it difficult to talk about as pastors, even in the mainline liberal tradition, is because, and this is especially true in the fundamentalist tradition of our faith and in the Roman Catholic Church in particular, that opposition to abortion on ethical grounds, and perhaps on masculinist grounds, is very, very common in church. I want to tread lightly because I'm a cisgendered man. And so my opinions on the matter are not as as important, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and what's interesting is the way that the conversation has been set up has kind of set it up as you have to do either this or that, and there's not really a lot of nuance in between. You can either be pro-life or you can be pro-choice, and there's not really much gray in between. Whereas I would argue that making sure that a child who is born is loved and able to be cared for is a pro-life position. Making sure that the woman who is receiving these medical services is honored, respected, handled with care is a pro-life perspective.
I suppose that if I believed that the fetus was indeed a person, then I would see it pretty black and white as well. That if it is a person, then it must be protected legally, and its destruction must be relegated to those circumstances which are most extreme. Same thing that we would say for any other person. I'm not, however, convinced that the fetus is a person, certainly not at early stages of pregnancy. It's a collection of cells. And one of the arguments that I often hear is the argument from potentiality, that the potentiality for personhood makes it a person. And I would say that's crap. The potentiality for something does not make it an actuality until that which actualizes it occurs. By that reasoning, the potential for my spouse and I to have sex is constitutes the existence of a potential person, and deciding not to have sex is murder, and that's crap. The next thing I would say is I think that the so-called pro-life movement is laser focused on abortion. Now, I don't think this is true of all of them. There are a number of folks who advocate for what they would call a consistent life ethic, which opposition to abortion, opposition to capital punishment, opposition to war, support for economic justice. There are a lot of folks that I know, especially in the Roman Catholic Church, who do that. They are a minority in the pro-life movement. But I certainly can appreciate their position a lot more than I can appreciate most of the so-called pro-life movement. In fact, I would accuse the pro-life movement of not being pro-life at all, but being anti-woman. And then the final thing that I'll say before I shut up, because I'm talking too much, is the Bible is very, very, how shall I say, unclear on the matter. No, actually, I take it back. It's quite clear. It's quite clear that the fetus is not a person. The Bible very openly says that the fetus is not a person. Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 through 23. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman, so there is a miscarriage, yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined. What the woman's husband demands. Okay, that's a little problematic, but shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judge determines. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life. Now, for all the problematic aspects of that passage, it is clear that the woman's life is valued far, far more than the fetus's life.
And even in medical ethics today, if the doctor has to make a choice between the two, the maternal health is always given priority. The other issue that I think gets more complicated is the fact that, you know, in the Bible times, all they really had was, you know, that you might have signs, you might have development, you might have what they called quickening, which is when they started feeling the fetus move. And even, isn't it funny how we stumble over this terminology, you know? And whereas today, we add a complicated layer when you can when you have things like ultrasound that can detect a pregnancy much earlier, much more visibly, and there are states that require that a woman who chooses an abortion have an ultrasound and see that, and you know, and so it's one of those areas where science, I think, has outpaced our ethics, if that makes sense.
Possibly. I also think that we really can't find a tremendous deal of help from science in determining whether or not the fetus is a person. That's a philosophical question.
It is, and I was going to say that earlier. Yeah, we're stuck in this philosophical place of what is personhood, what makes a living person alive. You know, in some sense, there's an argument that's made that a fetus is ultimately in the same status as a parasite because they can't live outside of themselves. You know, they depend on the nutrition from the mother. You know, so it is a really gray philosophical area.
Well, what is not a gray philosophical area is that the woman is most definitely a person. Mm-hmm. Or rather, it shouldn't be a gray philosophical area, but I think in the minds of some people even today, it is a little bit grayer than it should be, because I think that the personhood of women is controversial, though it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I because I think the autonomy of the woman over her own body is a key aspect of what makes a woman a person, or rather, bodily autonomy is a key aspect of one's personal life. If I do not have bodily autonomy, then in a very real sense, I am a slave. And what I would say is that the only way to be perfectly consistent with and there really are legal cases out there along these lines. The only way to be consistent with protecting fetoi is to open up the potentiality of liability for women who have miscarriages. And indeed, there are cases out there where women have been punished or potentially held liable for miscarriages.
Mm-hmm. Which makes me very sick.
Yes.
And here's why it makes me sick. I very, very easily could have naturally been a miscarriage. With my genetics, I very easily could have. And that gets into this place of this is not just a deep philosophical conversation. It hits very personally for people. And that's kind of why I said what I did at the beginning. And I think that is an important piece of this conversation, is that this is not just this heady theological philosophical thing. This is a reality. Amen. You know, and so yes, where women are, you know, interrogated and charged for possibly causing a miscarriage, there are so many freaking reasons that there can be a miscarriage that have nothing to do with anything that the woman has done. And to go through a miscarriage itself is already a painful enough experience.
Do we treat women as loaded guns? You know, the NRA safety rule that you always treat a gun as if it's loaded, even if you know it's not. Is that where we're going with this? That if we are to hold women liable to constantly care for themselves so that they can constantly care for a possible fetus that may or may not be there. The only way we would know is if the woman wasn't sexually active. Then the implication there is that we are to treat women like loaded guns, and we are to keep them constantly at home, constantly safe, in essence, constantly barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And that is the implication of pro-life ideology.
Well, and I mean, it seems to me that it's pretty standard that if a woman goes in for medical care, one of the things they often ask is the possibility of her being pregnant. Now, some of that is for good medical reasons, so that they, if she is, that they can appropriately medicate and treat and be aware of that. But then, yeah, it's this, like you say, what it does is it puts women, it kind of bubble wraps them for themselves, you know, and part of the argument from some of the anti-abortion is that it does harm to the women. In essence, there's already harm. There's already a cost for whatever has led to the situation that this woman is in the position that she's in. And one of the things that I also really appreciated about this movie is the character of the doctor, and how you know, he does this thing, and he does it from this place of he understands the bigger ethics of it, but it's not without cost for him. You can tell that it still has an impact on him.
What has an impact on him?
I think being in contact with the brokenness of the world, being in contact with seeing the pain that these women are experiencing, performing abortions. Not, and again, it's not that I'm saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying that day in and day out, I think there's something that it still has a cost for him.
I know that there are some feminists who might critique the film from that perspective. That the film, I think, is pro-choice, albeit from a male gaze, and I think we can talk about that in a minute. But it's pro-choice, but it also shows abortion as traumatic. It's traumatic on the doctor in the sense that it leads him to abuse ether. It's traumatic on the on Candy's character and on her boyfriend, the bomber pilot. And one wonders, well, and maybe this is from a masculinist perspective on my part, but one wonders why it is traumatic. Is it because a life is being terminated? And if that's the case, then does that open ethical questions about whether or not we should have abortions?
Yeah.
But the other thing that I might say is that, well, there are some feminist authors I've read who actually say that the degree to which abortion is traumatic is overblown in literature. That in fact it's actually a very safe procedure, and that is not to say that I mean it isn't traumatic for some women, but or that it's invalid that it would be for those for whom it is. But is it necessarily invalid that perhaps for some women who have abortions it isn't traumatic for them? Is it okay?
And I would say that's absolutely a fair interpretation as well. I think again, I reiterate that sometimes it's how we read into it and add to the layers of trauma, you know, and that's what concerns me so much about some of the legislation that comes up, where, you know, it just adds to the pain of the circumstances. You know, if it's very difficult for a woman to access that, even for a child that was absolutely wanted, and if something medically happens and she would still need a DNC, a dilation and curettage, you know, that even still, that medic on the billing and the coding, it shows up that way. And if insurance companies could just like say that's not allowed at all, that would be an issue.
I think that transitioning into other quite poignant aspects of the film, the way I'd like to do that is to talk a little bit about Marx in the following way. We are afraid of talking about reproduction as what it is. Now, because we think about talking about it mechanically and talking about it economically cheapens it in some sense. It doesn't. Having children is still a beautiful, spiritual, and wonderful thing, but it is nevertheless about control over the means of production and reproduction. And I think this speaks to other aspects of the film, and indeed the very name of the film, Cider House Rules, right? Who owns the means of production? Who sets the rules? And to me, the issue of abortion is largely about who controls the means of reproduction, because women take on the role of a kind of proletarian in that they work the means of reproduction, labor. They go into labor. Do they own those means of production? Are they theirs? Are they their own bodies? And
up until very recently, no. Because women, I mean, for one, for the longest time, even up to the 90s, there were some states who still had statutes on their book that there wasn't such a concept as marital rape. That wanted or not, women had to have sex with their husbands, and that's a piece. In the 60s and 70s, when birth control was first coming out, it had to be married couples, and it often had to be approved by the spouse. Even today, there are some doctors who refuse a woman who is not of a certain age, who's had so many kids, with permission from her spouse, to have her tubes tied or such. That's even still an issue today.
The woman as an uncontrovertible person with bodily autonomy should have the right to control her own means of production and reproduction. That is basic liberation theology.
And sorry, and then it also strikes me on the other side, and we need to talk about this too. There have also been stories about women in some of the immigrant detention centers and places like that have been sterilized forcibly.
Yes.
Or if not forcibly, at least unknowingly, without informed consent. So that has happened even today.
In the 1970s, there was a movement away from calling, or was it I'm not sure, but there was a movement away from speaking of the pro-choice movement as being pro-choice, reproductive choice, because in the minds of some, it made it about abortion itself, right? The choice to have an abortion, whereas it's not just about abortion. It's about abortion or carrying the child to term. And so in response, a number of feminists chose the term, instead of being pro-choice, pro-reproductive justice. And the attempt was to address that very issue, the fact that women not only have the right to choose to terminate unwanted pregnancies, but to not be sterilized, to have wanted pregnancies.
Right. So, and again, it's really interesting to me, as you've said, this movie is about so much more than just that issue of abortion. But it's funny how that's kind of what's easy to zero in on. I would also say that it's about coming of age and finding one's vocation and identity.
Yeah, and I think that's actually abortion is a MacGuffin in the film. It really we zero in on it, I think, and this is the reason why why you chose the film. I think. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
Partly, yeah. I wanted to speak about that in light of the Texas legislation and some of those pieces.
Dobbs versus Jackson, and the fact that we very well may be losing Roe versus Wade very shortly.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the film is not about abortion. The film uses the issue of abortion, I think, to make a point about autonomy and to make a point about coming of age, meaning coming into one's own, coming into the ability to make choices and make moral choices.
Because the doctor tries to do that to Wilbur to some extent, right? He falsely says that he has a heart condition. He keeps trying to push him into this place of, you're a doctor, this is what you're supposed to do. Ultimate.
Yeah, Dr. Larch, the character, Michael Caine's character, is a very, very interesting, and I think not by any means a moral hero, in the sense that he said that no one, outside of the film, no one would choose Homer's path for him. Homer Wells, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I called him Wilbur. Right? It's Homer. Yeah,
right. but no, Dr. Larch said that no one will choose Homer Wells' path for him, and yet he spends the entire movie choosing Homer Wells' path for him. To his credit, he does let Homer go, but he's manipulative about it. He sends him his doctor back. He's constantly wanting Homer to come back so that Homer can become a doctor, because that's what he, the father, wants of his son. They have a father-son relationship, though they are not father and son. And Homer resists the idea of becoming a doctor, and it strikes me as odd that he comes back to it by choice. That it might have been more interesting had he chosen to do something else at the end.
Well, and I think the way that the movie sets that up is that the situation with it's terrible that I cannot remember her name.
Candy?
Not Candy, the young woman who's raped by her father.
Oh.
And Homer says, I can help you with this. And that is kind of the thing for Homer to say, okay, I guess this is what I can bring to this. This is my skill and training.
Yeah, in that confrontation, so when Arthur Rose is confronting, or when Homer is confronting Arthur Rose asks him the question that frames the film, and that is, this isn't your business. Do you even know what your business is? Do you know what business you're in? What is your business? That sort of thing. And it's at that moment that Homer basically says, I'm a doctor. I'm in the doctor's business, is how he puts it. And I think that this relates to another ethical issue that the film takes a stand on, and that is being of some use. And I think the way Dr. Larch understands being of some use is that those who have the ability to do something about something have the responsibility to do something about something, and that, I think, is how the abortion issue in the film performs. Right, that's what the abortion issue is really. That's the point that it's making, that those who have the ability to do something to address a moral evil have the responsibility to do something to address a moral evil. And it is this realization that I think brings Homer back to his senses, if you want to put it that way, and makes him decide to become a doctor again instead of an apple picker. And I also think it's interesting that it is this, although the film pays lip service to the idea of reproductive choice, it is this issue in which the issue of abortion, the issue of not so much choice as the use of skill, and the use of skill to be of some use, in which the abortion issue really performs. And it's from a very, very male gaze, right? The film does not pass the Bechdel test. It didn't even come close to passing the Bechdel test. And while it is pro-choice, good for it, it is almost all of the moral heroes, with the possible exception of the nurses, are men. And
there are no moral heroes in this movie, I think.
Okay.
I would say that maybe the nurses, but I think that's kind of the point of the movie, is that there are no moral heroes in this.
Okay.
I think that part of it is no one's hands are really clean. It's something that we, as a culture, as a society, have to talk about and deal with together. So.
Yeah, and I think that moral hero is the wrong word, but the one who acts,
yeah,
I think is the one who makes themselves useful, and the one who makes the choice in spite of in the face of and in spite of all of the moral ambiguity of the situation. Because I think you're right, Dr. Larch. The fact that he performs abortions in the story does weigh on him, makes him a drug addict, in fact. And yet what leads him to do it is that he realizes that he has to make a choice. And
it's either he does them or someone else will do them, and it does more harm.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking from a doctor's perspective, the first rule, do no harm. And so for him, it's about reducing harm.
Yeah. The other thing that's so interesting is this principle of being of some use. I hold that in tension because it's with the principle of Sabbath, that we don't live to work, we work to live. We live to enjoy our life. That God gives us life as a gift. Mm-hmm. And so whether or not we can be of use says absolutely nothing about our worth in the eyes of God. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. I don't know if this is directly relevant, but I loved the part where he's being taught how to pick apples.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, I never knew this, and I don't know if this is entirely true. I'm going to take it at its face value. The fact that on the apple tree, on the limb, there's the apple, but then there's already next year's bud. And you can't take both, or you'll be taking too much.
Mm-hmm.
You'll take next year's fruit. And so I found that really interesting. And with the concept of Sabbath, right, that you're right, that it's not just about what we can produce. It's not about doing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's okay to let be, to rest, to simply treasure who we are created to be.
Yes. And I think the film takes on a very existentialist posture, in that it is more about coming of age in the sense of learning how to be a moral, not hero, but person, in that it's about learning how to make a choice to be of some use, in spite of the ambiguity and the implications of that choice for good and for worse. So what do you think of the character of Arthur Rose?
Oh boy, that's another gray area, right? Because I really, it's like I want to like him, because I think he, generally speaking, treats Homer with a great deal of respect, and he teaches him the business without a lot of judgment about it. But when we find out that he has raped his daughter, and he doesn't even really understand the concept of that, I mean, it's really like he doesn't process that is a harm, right? And I have a really hard time with that. Mm-hmm. that to me, that kind of overrides all of the good in him. But again, it's kind of what I said earlier, where there's no one really has clean hands in this. I think I would be interested to know more about him. He seems like a really fascinating character, because we see some glimpses of that when he is addressing the man who threw a cigarette into the batch of cider, and you kind of get the sense that maybe he's been there himself at one point. And then again, with everything that happens, I want to take him at his word, but I'm not sure I do when he says that he was just trying to say goodbye to Rose when he ends up being killed. And he does ultimately do the right thing by saying, you tell them that I did this so that she can be free.
And caused himself a tremendous amount of pain in because he moved the knife around himself in order to make it look like he stabbed himself. Because you can tell by looking at a wound if it's self-inflicted or not. So he did self-inflict it in order to, well, it was already inflicted by Rose, but he did add to it from himself.
Our Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign, New Year, New Faith, New Media, continues, and we are doing very well. As of Monday, February 7th, we were 70% funded with $350 and 24 days to go. Our goal is to get our own website, where we can have a digital home base independent of Facebook and other social media platforms. We'll have the archives of all our episodes, discussion forums, ways to sign up for mailing lists, and all sorts of other cool stuff. At this point, it also looks very possible to push past our modest $500 goal and possibly hit one of our stretch goals. At $700, for instance, we'll be able to afford to give our web developer a $50 bonus, as well as get NFNM a G Suite Pro membership for a year, so that we can improve our internal and external communication, as well as our data infrastructure. If you have not contributed yet, we urge you to do so however you can, either with money or by sharing your experience with New Faith, New Media in MeetSpace or on social media. The link for the campaign is bit.ly/NFNMINDIE, and it will also be in the show notes.
I think if he's not redeemed in that moment, he comes very damn close to his redemption at that moment. It doesn't take away from what he did, and from the fact that he tried to skirt responsibility for it.
Yeah.
There's also, I feel, he frames the movie in the following way, in that he keeps asking that question over and over again. What business are you in? What business are you in? This is none of your business, right?
Whose business is this conversation?
Right. And ultimately, I think Homer's coming of age is made complete when Homer finally says, I'm making this my business. On the other hand, does he put it that way? He doesn't say, I'm making this my business. He says, I can help. He offers to make it his business. But it's the choice of not walking by on the other side, like
I was just gonna say the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yes.
It's the Samaritan who stops and says, yeah, we're going to deal with this person who is bloody and hurting on the side of the road and naked, with no the reason that the story makes the person naked is there's no sense of what class he belongs to. You cannot tell a person without their clothes. So are we willing to help any human being?
Yes. I am in the business of caring for others is ultimately, I think, the choice that Dr. Larch makes. And that's his description, I think, of himself at the beginning. The caretaker of many, the father of none, I think is what he says. And I think that when Homer answers the question, I'm in the doctor business, and he puts it that way. He doesn't say, I am a doctor. He says, I'm in the doctor business. In other words, I'm in the business of caring for other people. And I can help you if you let me.
The other ethical quandary I think that is raised is when Dr. Larch chooses to falsify Homer's education. I mean, because yes, he has trained in an apprenticeship under Dr. Larch for many, many years, basically since he's old enough to have done so. But he's always on about other people who have done harm. So it's kind of interesting to me, that decision to do that. And I get that for him it's a calculation of not of wanting someone to succeed him that he trusts in that position versus someone that the board tries to bring in that he manipulates them from bringing in.
That part of the film bothers the hell out of me, because at some point someone's going to catch them. Homer cannot carry on indefinitely with fake medical credentials. He cannot. Someone's going to catch them. And yet the film plays it as if, no, they're not. It's the way Homer comes back and takes his rightful place. There really isn't much to the deception in the film about creating Homer's educational background, which doesn't exist. And yet it is a tremendously harmful thing to do. And when they are caught, not if, when they are caught, of course, I think in the film's universe, they're probably not caught. When they are caught, that institution could be shut down. Those boys and girls could find themselves shoved off to other institutions, and if that, and well, who's going
Homer
to
could be tried with murder?
Yeah, who's going to provide the reproductive care that is needed in that community?
Yeah. So it just occurred to me, thinking about the significance of names. We're talking about Homer, and I'm thinking about the Odyssey, and how Homer goes on a sort of odyssey, where he goes out and he experiences the world in all of its joys and sorrows. And then makes his way home again.
Yeah. And his leaving of the hospital at the beginning, I think we in our conversation, we sort of thought of that as a kind of leaving Eden. And indeed, what does he do but goes off to pick apples? Of course, apples are not necessarily the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in scripture, but he goes off to pick apples, to pick fruit, right? Yeah. And that made me wonder about the story of Eden. And I think our colleague who did the Matrix episode with us,
Michael Brown.
Reverend Brown put it this way, that what if we were to look at Eden in a different way and a different light? What if we were to see, and I don't see it this way, but it's an interesting thought experiment of human beings were in the right in Eden, because human beings were, it is right that children go off at some point and experience the world. It is right that children leave home. And there is the idea of a parent who resists that is very, very common in literature. So what if, we often look at Adam and Eve as the disobedient humans who did what they shouldn't have done, but what if they're just the children who want to leave home, and God is the parent who has to learn to use process theology, which I also don't believe in, has to learn how to let them go as part of loving them. Of course, I don't think Dr. Larch learns that lesson very well, if Dr. Larch is to be the God character. But then again, I also resist the idea of Dr. Larch as the God character, because I think this film is a thoroughly atheistic film.
Yeah. I would agree.
Though there is also some original sin in it, in the sense that there's a conversation that Homer has with Dr. Larch after they come across the young girl who had the botched abortion, and they have a conversation about responsibility, and Homer has an expectation that people can be responsible for themselves, and the doctor does not. People are not responsible. The doctor's views of human beings in general are fairly dark, I think, and fairly close to what we might call original sin. And as a result, he looks at the world in a very, very dark and negative light, which is,
well, he has seen the brokenness of the world.
Mhm.
You know, he's seen the difficult circumstances.
And Homer sees it in a much more naive wonder, or with a much more naive wonder. He goes out to experience this wondrous place. And to be fair, he does experience it as a wondrous place. He does find friendship in the bomber pilot, and later, and this here's some original sin too. Later, he finds a certain kind of friendship in the bomber pilot's girlfriend.
Yeah, more than just friendship.
More than friendship, yes. He sleeps with her repeatedly, and betrays him, who really and who really cared for Homer at the beginning of his having left the orphanage. And
Yeah,
so
who got him the job to be at the apple orchard,
and that leads me to ask the question of, what do you think of Candy, the Homer's and the bomber pilot's girlfriend?
You know, that the thing that I'm always noticing about her is her need and desire to sew fig leaves. You know, in the sense that, like, she once she has had her abortion, she hardly ever talks about it again, unless it's to Rose later on to say, hey, he helped me, he can help you too. She's also the one who is always, I have clothes for you, Rose. You know, and I you know, I was trying to make sense of that. Is that kind of an elitist thing? Is that you know, is this, part of what I see in her relationship with Rose is she's someone who's been there, and so she's willing to reach out a hand to help her. I still think she's also pretty naive about the world, you know. And to me, I guess that was one thing that I thought about in just impressions as a whole of the movie, is, you know, just how important it is to be able to have conversations around human sexuality, and, you know, what is the process of giving birth, because we don't talk about that enough, you know.
It seems that the phrase that's put into her mouth is wait and see, right? She wants to wait and see. Are we going to leave the bomber pilot for Homer? Let's wait and see. We learn that the pilot's coming home after having been injured. Are we going to, you know, go back? Well, let's wait and see. And then finally she makes her decision, and Homer says, well, at least we don't have to wait and see anymore. And I wonder if the film really suggests that her let's wait and see is a kind of cowardice, a kind of inability
sometimes
to make
a decision not to make a decision is to decide.
Yes.
And we talked about with Into the Woods.
Well, yes. And I think that the film would say that it is to Homer's and to Dr. Larch's credit that what makes them moral, quote unquote, heroes, if you want to call them that, but you're right, they're not, is that they are the ones who make the decision. They realize that a decision has to be made, and they make it. Right. And to her credit, Candy does end up making a decision, for better and for worse. She decides to go back to the bomber pilot, whose name is Wally Worthington. That's right. And I think Homer, I guess I read Homer's statement, well, at least we don't have to wait and see anymore, as a kind of well done to her. But I wasn't, I think this is probably latent sexism on my part, in much the same way as I kind of found myself thinking of the characters of in Pulp Fiction, the female characters in Pulp Fiction. I was not particularly impressed with Candy's character. not that I have to be impressed. Not that she has to impress me. But I felt her to be very childish. And God forgive me if I'm not seeing her.
I mean, there is like I said, there's that naivete about the world. And yet, of course, she's experienced some of the world. Because it takes a level of maturity and, to say, I'm going to care for this man who's now paralyzed.
True.
And I wonder, this is pretty glossed over, but I thought about the irony of that, where she's had an abortion and now he comes home paralyzed, potentially not likely to be able to have a child then. I wonder if there's a sense in which she may, it doesn't, the film doesn't say anything about this, but it's just me wondering. I wonder, in retrospect, would she regret making that decision then? Would she wish that maybe she had kept that child?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And again, I'm not making a judgment on that decision. It's just you wonder, right?
Does yes, and I what really got me was when she said, "I can't stand to be alone," which is the reason why she has sex with Homer. Yeah, because she can't stand to be alone. She needs Homer.
And that is where I agree that she has a level of immaturity to her and naivete, that she is someone who just has to have someone,
Does the film suggest to you, Pastor Michelle, that moral maturity is found in choosing what doesn't necessarily make us happy as individuals? Because it seems to me that Homer chooses to go back to being a doctor, not because he particularly wants to be a doctor, but because he realizes that he can be of some use there. And she chooses to go back to Wally Worthington because she cares for him, even though it may not be what she wants.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely a read. Where I struggle with that is that the logical extension is there ever a place to be okay with saying, I'm going to make a decision for myself and what's best?
Well, exactly. And that's part of,
that's the question.
That's part of why I wonder if that's part of why I wonder if it's not a particularly good movie. To be fair, dear listener, I do think it's a good movie. But if I wonder if in fact it's moral, the moral of the story, the moral of the movie is not one that's actually very good. That because to me, or perhaps it's one that needs to be held in tension with another moral, which is that it is okay to make decisions for yourself. It is okay to go off and find yourself to be of use as an apple picker. Right. You don't have to be a doctor.
Yeah. Well, and I guess if there's anything that I would say about this movie in terms of a moral, it is that ability to hold tension between multiple perspectives, because it does on many issues. It provides a lot of perspectives on things.
Well, it never really addresses why, for instance, Dr. Larch is a druggie, a drug addict. I really shouldn't say druggie, mea culpa. But why is he a drug addict? What is he self-medicating from? We often assume it's because he performs abortions. What if it's because he just doesn't want to be there? What if it's because he never made the choice that Homer made? And what if Homer's choice to return to the orphanage was in fact not a happy ending? It's played off as a happy ending, but what if it's an oppressive ending? It's Homer's.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did someone say to him, "You're a doctor.
Yes. And yes, the world needs doctors. And yes, Homer can be of use as a doctor and care for people as a doctor, and that's wonderful. And on the other hand, part of being a human being is setting boundaries and saying, it's not about me. I don't have to be the one to solve the world's problems. I can contribute, but I don't have to be the one to solve the world's problems. To say that I have to be the one to solve the world's problem, that's just narcissism.
So, the role of the ritual around if someone has left the orphanage, if they've been adopted, or if they have died. What did you make of that?
I thought it was beautiful. I thought that there were a number of rituals at the orphanage, I think, that were quite beautiful, especially and the one thing I think that is to both Homer's and Dr. Larch's great credit is that they seemed to care very, very deeply for those orphans. And were very, very kind to them in a time when, well, it's not a different time, this is still true, when orphanages were not good places, where children did not find that kind of kindness.
Yeah, they wouldn't be called kings of Maine, princes of...
Yes.
Or right. Kings of New England, princes of Maine.
Yes. And yes, you are my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. Is where your mind was in our conversation when you heard that. Good night, you princes of Maine, you kings of New England. Good night, my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased.
Yeah, and for them, how many times had they heard that, or would they have heard that? We all need to hear that. I think. We all need to know that we are loved.
Absolutely.
I want to go back. We kind of talked about this, but I want to go back to it again. Michael Caine says he's caretaker of many, but father of none, and yet he really does play a father role to Homer. And I would even argue to some extent to the other boys.
I wonder if that's Dr. Larch's I'm not a doctor moment. I'm not a father, in spite of the fact that he really is.
That's a fair point. That is absolutely a fair point. I would agree, because he's he does very much act in that way, and it's he and Homer kind of tag team in that regard as well.
Well, the one boy asks Homer, "Do you ever want to meet your parents, your biological parents?" Homer's like, "No, they're not my parents.
Yeah.
They never did the things that parents do. Dr. Larch does the things that parents do."
Yeah, there's definitely a theme of what is family, and Homer has a family in this orphanage. He finds one, I think, with the other workers at the apple orchard. Let's talk about the cider house rules.
Yes, thank you. That which was hidden in plain sight. Oh yeah. Gosh.
So the name comes from in the place where the workers could stay. There was this list of rules. Now, most of the workers were not able to read, which we haven't really even talked about issues around race and class yet, which we could. But, there's these rules. Most of them may read a little bit, but they have Homer read the rules. And there's this place where, don't smoke inside. People have smoked inside. Don't sit out on the roof. Well, the roof is the best place to have lunch, and eventually the line that I love so much is, those rules aren't for us. Those aren't our rules. We didn't create them. They were given by someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How very Marxist. It's we seize our own means of production. And we choose how to do our own work and work according to our own strictures. And yeah, it's interesting that the person who I think really frames the film in the sense of coming of age as rejecting law and taking upon oneself the spirit, if you will, is Alfred Rose or Albert Rose, the rapist. So I wonder if that's part of his character's ambiguity. Yeah, I wonder if that's part of his character's ambiguity.
Yeah. Well, and then to me, I also think about, I am always a firm believer in the people who are impacted by the rules should be the ones to make the rules. And I think that is part of the conversation too, is that the rules are made by people who've never actually had to live out there.
Which gets back to the issue of abortion, I think. That
yeah. There was that picture of a committee that was having a conversation around abortion, and how many women were on that committee? 0. So I think that that's an important, who's at the table, who makes decisions, who's impacted by the decisions.
Yes. And it's oh wow.
And yet, so the other thing that's really interesting is Homer puts the rules back up when they're moving
repeatedly.
Yeah, when they come back after, so the way that it works is that some of the labor will travel to different places to help with different harvest seasons, and so they leave, Homer stays. When they come back, he puts the rules up again, which is just really interesting.
Yeah, and it seems to me that he's constantly trying to decide whether to subject himself to these rules or not, even though he doesn't take them seriously. And it's finally when he chooses his own path, which oddly enough is the path to go back to the hospital. So it's not his own path, that he, I think, tears down the cider house rules, which
and throws them in the furnace.
Yeah. I also what do you make of the furnaces, the mini furnaces in the film?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously there's this image of, I hate it, if you believe it, there's the image of hell to some extent, of like flames and fiery furnace, and yet there's also, these are things that we're discarding and letting go of and leaving behind.
Well, the people, there are two. There's the furnaces, but there's also the graveyards, or the graveyard scenes. Like whenever anyone dies, you see Dr. Larch putting up a gravestone, but whenever a fetus is aborted, it is put into the furnace, discarded. And regardless of what I may feel about abortion, that strikes me as a little wrong.
Yeah, I would think a burial would still be appropriate. Although, to be fair, many make the choice to be cremated now. So.
Well, we had a conversation. Is it better to be alive versus to be alive at all, versus is it? How did you put it? Because Homer was having a conversation with the other one, whom they were kind of training up as the protege, probably wasn't going to be adopted, and they came to a conversation on abortion, and Homer, who really I think resists the idea of abortion throughout the course of the film, although he ends up performing one, says something about how would you rather be in the incinerator?
That's right. Yeah.
It's almost as if the child that Homer is speaking to takes up the kind of the position that not all life is worth living, and Homer takes on the position that, well, it's better to be alive at all. And you asked, I think, in our conversation, like, is it better to just be alive, or is it better to have a life worth living? And I wonder if part of my reflection is, and at the risk of coming down on the side of being pro-life or anti-abortion, I wonder if the only person that you can ask about that would be the people who get born and the people who are incinerated.
Mm-hmm.
That at the end of the day, it's I don't believe that all life is inherently worth living, but I would say that it's up to the individual person to choose to see their life as worth living. And I would also say that it's not for us to decide for them that their life isn't worth living and therefore to terminate it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, and that's where all of this gets so complicated, because that is kind of one side of the argument, that, you know, who speaks for this child, this fetus, a child, you know, whatever, however you language, you know, who determines what life is worth living or not. And there's the sense of humans aren't supposed to play God, making the decision over life and death.
Yeah, Dr. Larch very, very clearly, I think, embraces playing. In fact, I think he says so. Mm-hmm. He says something, yes, I'm playing God. Of course I'm playing God. Someone has to, or something like that. Mm-hmm. Someone has to decide. Someone has to make the choice. If no one else will, I will. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. The film is complicated. It doesn't. We said at the beginning of the conversation that it's a pro-choice film. I'm not sure that it is. I don't think it's entirely anti-choice, but it does, I think, give voice in the character of Homer, at least the Homer prior to performing the abortion on Rose. It does give voice to the pro-life argument,
and not in a caricatured way.
Mm-hmm.
Which I have to respect.
Yes.
Because sometimes it's easy that either side gets kind of reduced to its extreme. You know, it's made out more than it is. You know, whereas here, I like I said, I do like that there's some nuance where none of it's really entirely black and white and clear. You know.
So if you're preaching a sermon on this film, what would the takeaway be for the congregation?
Oh gosh, I think it would be just that, you know, life is not always a simple decision, that you know, you might even talk about like the 10 Commandments. Do we receive those like a set of cider house rules given to us but don't really treat them like ours? How do we make them, what does law and grace look like together? You know, because usually when you look at rules often are there for a reason. Sometimes they're arbitrary, but there are, you know, not smoking inside is probably not a bad thing. You know, being up on the roof might be a safety issue. You know, so to some extent, there is a necessity for rules and boundaries and regulations, and also the importance and the justice of those being impacted by those needing to be part of the conversation.
I think, yeah, and I think I might talk a little bit about an issue that we might have spent a little bit more time on, and that is the tension in Scripture between law and grace, mm-hmm. and law and spirit. Yeah. Because, you know, when I hear Arthur Rose's rejection of the Cider House rules, as being a rejection of law, in the same way I think that St. Paul rejects law, not rejection of the Torah per se, but rejection of legalism. Mm-hmm. and
Yeah.
really claiming, and here's the spirit that claiming that rules have to be owned by the people who are most affected by them.
Mhm.
You know, these rules were made by not us, so
Mhm.
therefore they are irrelevant. We make our rules.
That's why when I have a confirmation class, I don't often just sit down and here's your rules for the class. I say, okay, let's create a covenant together about how we're going to interact. And I may have some suggestions, but ultimately we do it together so that it's not just about me handing it down.
So, Michelle, what's next?
Well, our next movie is going to be The Thin Red Line, a 1997 war movie, which I have not seen, so I'm looking forward to checking it out.
This one's my pick, actually. Cider House Rules was your pick, and then we do mine, and then Gail's, and then Wesley's. And yeah, this is my absolute favorite film, The Thin Red Line. If I had a favorite movie, period, it would be this one. And it's Terrence Malick. It's an absolute masterpiece, and we'll get into it as to why.
So we thank you for joining us today on A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater, which is a production of the New Faith New Media Company. And we invite you to support us by checking out all of our other shows, including Faith in What Resonates by Gail Gallagher, who also did our music for today's episode. We also want to thank our editor, Wesley Morrison Sloat, who makes us sound far more intelligent than I think I come off, speaking for myself. We are so thankful that you connect with us and that you engage in these conversations. We invite you to like, comment, share, let all of your friends know about this podcast and get the word out there as we really try and engage in theology in a way that we build community together through quite a bit of nerdery as well. And so we thank you for all the ways that you support us through our Patreon, through sharing, liking, subscribing, and just for all of the support that you give. We thank you, and we will see you again soon.
Ow!
We would like to thank the following people for participating in our Indiegogo campaign: Al Cole, Gail Gallagher, CJ Toor, Katie Oberly, Susan Lavelle, Richard Bell, Lori Morrison, Cameron Hood, Lindsay Brown, and Sue Burke, as well as all of our donors who wish to remain anonymous. The New Faith New Media community is growing faster and stronger than we had ever dreamed it would, and we are looking forward to finding out what we can accomplish together.